What if the discovery of the Americas was actually a last-ditch do-or-die gamble by a Europe that was being slowly strangled? Let's rewind the clock. Before the sails of a certain Genoese dreamer ever billowed in the Atlantic wind, the known world was holding its breath. The stage for this drama wasn't the open ocean, but the ancient, sun-drenched cradle of civilization, the Mediterranean Sea. For thousands of years, this was the superhighway of history, the lifeblood of empires. But the highways were closing, forcing the great powers of Europe to stare into the terrifying, unknown void of the Atlantic. To understand why, we need to look at two colossal forces that had Europe in a pincer grip. First, let's turn our gaze west to the Iberian Peninsula modern day, Spain and Portugal. For nearly 800 years, from the year 711 AD, this land was known as ruled by a succession of Muslim dynasties, known in the West as the Moors. Now, when we hear the word occupation, we might think of a grim, oppressive force. But Al-Andalus was anything but. This was a civilization of unparalleled brilliance. Cities like Cordoba were beacons of light in a Europe still mired in the Dark Ages. It boasted paved streets, oil-lit lamps, and libraries that dwarfed anything the Christian kingdoms could imagine, containing hundreds of thousands of volumes of science, philosophy, and poetry. This wasn't just a golden age for Muslims. It was a society where Moorish, Jewish, and Christian cultures intertwined, creating a vibrant tapestry of thought and innovation. Scholars from all three faiths worked side by side, translating ancient Greek texts, advancing mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. The architecture they left behind, like the Alhambra in Granada, still whispers tales of this sophisticated world. But this cultural flourishing came with a hard geopolitical reality. Their physical presence meant strategic dominance over the Western Mediterranean. The choke point, the narrow Strait of Gibraltar, the mythical Pillars of Hercules, was under the constant shadow of their power. For the emerging Christian kingdoms of Iberia, like Castile and Aragon, every ship that passed, every trade route they tried to use, was a negotiation. Accessing the sea lanes was always costly, always contested. This was the first deep, centuries-long constraint on Europe's westward ambitions. Now, let's shift our focus to the other side of the map. Turn your eyes east, to the lands where Europe bleeds into Asia. Here, another power was rising, born from a dream. Legend tells us that Osman I, the founder of what would become the Ottoman Empire, had a vision of a mighty tree growing from his chest, its branches covering the entire world. A prophecy, perhaps, because the empire that bore his name grew with astonishing speed. The Ottomans were a force of nature. Their armies, disciplined and technologically advanced, wielding gunpowder and massive cannons, seemed unstoppable. They weren't just conquering territory, they were swallowing entire empires. The Byzantine Empire, the last remnant of ancient Rome, which had stood for 1,000 years, was their ultimate prize. In 1453, a date that should be seared into our historical memory, the Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed the Conqueror, achieved the impossible. He breached the legendary walls of Constantinople. He didn't just sail his ships into the city's harbor. He famously had them dragged overland on greased logs, bypassing the defensive chain that had protected it for centuries. The fall of Constantinople sent a shockwave across Christendom. It wasn't just a symbolic defeat, it was a strategic catastrophe. The city, renamed Istanbul, became the new capital of the Ottoman Empire, and with it, the Ottomans seized control of the Silk Road and the primary trade routes, connecting Europe to the riches of the East. The gateway to Asia had been slammed shut and locked from the inside. So now, picture the map in your mind. In the West, the lingering Moorish influence and control over the Strait of Gibraltar make Atlantic trade a risky and expensive venture. In the East, the unstoppable Ottoman Empire has a stranglehold on the traditional land and sea routes to India, China, and the Spice Islands. Europe, particularly the Iberian kingdoms of Portugal and Spain, was caught in a geopolitical vice. This double-edged constraint triggered an acute economic crisis. These kingdoms were already in a precarious financial state. Remember, for centuries, they had been pouring resources into the Reconquista, the long, grueling campaign to push the Moors out of Iberia. This was a war that defined their identity, but it was also a massive drain on their treasuries. And now, on top of that, the cost of simply participating in global commerce became unbearable. Think about what Europe craved from the East. Spices, not just for flavor, but as preservatives for meat in a world without refrigeration. We're talking about pepper, cloves, cinnamon, and nutmeg. These weren't just luxuries. They were vital commodities. Add to that the demand for fine silks, porcelain, and other exotic goods. Before the Ottomans, this trade was already expensive, passing through many middlemen. But now, with the Ottomans controlling the source, they could impose whatever taxes and tariffs they wished. Every ounce of spice, every roll of silk that reached Lisbon or Seville came with a punishing levy. This wasn't just about the rich paying more for their pepper. It was about the financial viability of entire nations. The crowns of Portugal and Spain were paying a crushing premium, bleeding gold and silver just to maintain their connection to the world market. Their rivals, like the Italian city-states of Venice and Genoa, had long-standing deals with the Eastern powers. But for Iberia, the situation was becoming untenable. They were being priced out of the world. What do you do when the front door and the back door are both blocked by powerful rivals? You start looking for another way in. You start looking for a window, a secret passage, a crazy, improbable route that everyone else has dismissed. This is the moment that desperation transforms into innovation. The Portuguese, with their long Atlantic coastline, were the first to make a serious move. Under the visionary leadership of Prince Henry the Navigator, they began a methodical, step-by-step exploration down the coast of Africa. They weren't looking for America. They were looking for a way around Africa to get to the spices of India. It was a slow, dangerous process, pushing further and further into uncharted waters, developing new ship designs like the caravel and new navigational techniques. Each voyage was a massive risk, but the potential reward direct access to the spice trade, bypassing the Ottomans and their taxes was immeasurable. This is the context into which Christopher Columbus steps. He wasn't a lone genius who just randomly thought the world was round. Most educated people at the time knew the world was a sphere. The real debate was about its size. Columbus, based on some flawed calculations, passionately believed the Earth was much smaller than it actually was. He argued that you could reach the East Indies, the source of the spicy, spice-sailing West. It was a radical, audacious idea. He pitched his plan to the Portuguese, but their experts, who had better calculations of the Earth's circumference, rejected him. They knew his math was wrong and that he would run out of supplies long before reaching Asia. They were right, of course, but they were also wrong. So, Columbus turned to Portugal's rivals, the Spanish monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella. In 1492, they, however, were busy with Columbus's risky proposal, which the Portuguese had deemed insane. Maybe was. But what if he was right? It would be a shortcut to immense wealth, leapfrogging both their Portuguese rivals and the Ottoman gatekeepers. It was a Hail Mary pass, born from centuries of geopolitical pressure and economic suffocation. And so, the seeds of desperation, sown by the Moorish presence in the west and the Ottoman stranglehold in the east, finally bloomed into the age of exploration. It was a desperate reach for a new path, a final, westward gamble to break a chokehold that threatened to bankrupt kingdoms and cut Europe off from the world. History is rarely a simple story of heroes and adventurers. It's a complex chain of cause and effect, of pressures and reactions. Picture the closed gates, the punishing taxes, and the desperate monarchs who, backed into a corner, financed a long-shot voyage that would change the world forever. So, first things first, who were the Moors? This was a term used in Europe for the diverse Muslim populations who ruled over the Iberian Peninsula, what they called Al-Andalus, for nearly 800 years, from 711 to 1492. These weren't a single ethnic group. They were a dynamic mix of Berbers from North Africa, Arabs, and local Iberians who had converted to Islam. But this flourishing civilization was under constant pressure. For centuries, The Christian kingdoms in the north of the peninsula waged a long, grueling series of campaigns to retake the land. This effort is known to history as the Reconquista, or It wasn't a single, continuous war, but a centuries-long struggle that profoundly shaped the identity of two future global powers, Portugal and Spain. Let's look at Portugal first. The Portuguese Reconquista really gained momentum with its first king, Afonso, and he was a formidable military leader who carved out the nation's borders through a series of critical victories. The most famous of these was the Siege of Lisbon in 1147. With the help of crusaders on their way to the Holy Land, Afonso captured the strategic city, a major turning point. The Portuguese effort continued for another century, culminating in 1249 with the capture of the southern region of the Alps. With that, Portugal's Reconquista was largely complete, and the nation began to look outwards, towards the sea. Meanwhile, in Spain, the process was more fragmented, with several Christian kingdoms vying for control. The final, decisive phase of the Spanish Reconquista began with one of history's most famous power couples, Isabella I of Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon. Their marriage united the two largest Christian kingdoms in Spain, creating a powerful, unified front against the last remaining Moorish territory. This was the Emirate of Granada, a small but wealthy kingdom in the south, famous for its magnificent Alhambra palace. After a long and difficult war, the forces of Isabella and Ferdinand conquered Granada in 1492, bringing the nearly 800-year-long Muslim rule in Iberia to a definitive end. And this is where our story takes a crucial, dark turn. The end of the Reconquista didn't just end a war. It unleashed an expansionist energy, and it came with a chilling religious justification that would have devastating global consequences. Having spent centuries fighting what they considered a holy war against Muslims, or Saracens, the Portuguese, in particular, sought the highest possible authority to bless their continued expansion, this time into North Africa and down its Atlantic coast. And they got it directly from the Pope. This brings us to a critical, but often overlooked, document. The Papal Bull, known as Dum Diversas, issued in 1452 by Pope Nicholas V to King Afonso V of Portugal. This decree was nothing short of a license for conquest and enslavement. I want to read you the key line because its impact is staggering. The bull granted Portugal the full and free permission to invade, search out, capture, and subjugate the Saracens and pagans and any other unbelievers, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery. Let that sink in, perpetual slavery. Initially, this was framed within the context of the ongoing fight against the Moors in North Africa, but the Portuguese quickly applied this broad permission to the new peoples they encountered as their ships ventured further and further down the West African coast. They were no longer just fighting rival powers. They were now discovering lands inhabited by non-Christian pagans, and the Pope had given them a religious and legal green light to enslave them. It didn't stop there. 3 years later, in 1455, another papal bull, Romanus Pontifex, reinforced this. It granted Portugal exclusive rights to all territory and trade along the African coast, further cementing the justification for enslaving non-Christian peoples. These papal bulls weren't just abstract theological documents. They became the legal and moral cornerstone for the burgeoning transatlantic slave trade. They transformed the capture and sale of human beings from a grim reality of war into a religiously sanctioned, state-sponsored enterprise. So, when we look at the Reconquista, we're not just seeing the end of Moorish Spain. We are witnessing the birth of a new era. The same maritime expertise and expansionist ambition that Portugal honed during its Reconquista propelled its explorers around Africa and eventually to Brazil. And the horrific justification for perpetual slavery, first articulated as a weapon against the Moors, became the foundational logic for the enslavement of millions of Africans, creating a brutal system that would shape the Americas and the entire modern world. The connection is direct and undeniable. The end of one chapter of conquest in Iberia opened a new, far more global chapter of colonization and exploitation, tragically blessed by the highest religious authority in Christendom. Spain was a country that bet its entire future on one sailor's crazy idea. But why? Well, in 1492, Spain was in a tight spot, and that crazy idea belonged to a man named Christopher Columbus. This wasn't just a story of adventure. It was a desperate gamble that would change the world forever. The year 1492 is etched in history, but not just for one reason. It was a year of incredible triumph and crippling crisis for Spain. The Catholic monarchs, Isabella and Ferdinand, had just completed the Reconquista, a centuries-long campaign to retake the Iberian Peninsula. Their victory parade marched through the streets of Granada, the last Muslim stronghold. Spain was finally united under one crown and one faith. It should have been a moment of pure celebration, right? Well, not quite. While the victory banners were flying high, the royal treasury was bone dry. Centuries of warfare had completely drained the kingdom's finances. And this wasn't their only problem. Spain was trapped, squeezed between two massive geopolitical rivals who controlled all the money-making routes. To the east, the mighty Ottoman Empire still had a stranglehold on the overland trade routes to Asia, the famous Silk Road. All the spices, silks, and other luxury goods that Europeans craved had to pass through their territory, or through their Italian partners like Venice. This monopoly meant prices were astronomical. Imagine paying $100 for a pinch of pepper. Spain, being at the far end of Europe, was basically priced out of this lucrative market. They were getting the scraps while others got rich, so why not just sail around Africa like their neighbors, the Portuguese? Bad news there, too. To the west and south, Portugal had already cornered the market. For decades, their explorers had been meticulously mapping the African coast, establishing trading posts, and creating a maritime superhighway. They were bringing back shiploads of gold, ivory, and unfortunately, enslaved people. Portugal was flush with cash, and they weren't about to share their secret routes. Spain was effectively blocked on all sides, economically strangled and commercially excluded. They were a newly unified kingdom with grand ambitions, but with empty pockets and no way to fill them. Isabella and Ferdinand were desperate. They needed a radical solution, a Hail Mary pass to get back in the game. And that's when a persistent Italian sailor, Cristoforo Colombo, or as we know him, Cristoforo Columbus, re-entered the picture. His idea was simple, audacious, and, according to most experts at the time, completely wrong. He proposed reaching the riches of the East India, China, the Spice Islands by sailing west across the open Atlantic. Remember, he believed the world was much smaller than it actually is. Royal advisors had repeatedly shot down his plan, pointing out, correctly, that his calculations were way off. The journey would be far longer than he claimed, and his crew would likely starve before they ever saw land. So why, after all these rejections, did Isabella and Ferdinand suddenly change their minds? Because their situation had changed. The victory at Granada gave them the confidence and the political unity to take a massive risk. More importantly, they were out of other options. Columbus's crazy idea was no longer just a fool's errand. It was a high-stakes opportunity. It was a calculated gamble. If Columbus was right, or even partially right, Spain could bypass both the Ottoman chokehold in the east and the Portuguese monopoly in the south. They could create their own private trade route to the unimaginable wealth of Asia. The funding of his voyage wasn't an act of blind faith and exploration. It was a shrewd geopolitical and economic move born from absolute necessity. It was Spain's all-or-nothing bet to secure its place as a global power. And so, in August 1492, from the port of Palos de la Frontera, Spain's gamble became a reality. 3 small ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, sailed west into the unknown. This single voyage, driven by a need to escape a geopolitical trap, was about to set in motion the age of exploration in the West and rewrite the course of human history. After a surprisingly swift journey of about 5 weeks, on October 12, 1492, a lookout spotted land. Columbus and his crew had reached an island in what we now call the Bahamas, likely San Salvador. But in Columbus's mind, he had succeeded. He believed he had landed in the Indies, the outlying islands of Asia. This is why he called the native people he encountered Indians, a mistake that would stick for centuries. Now, let's be clear, about the mission's goal versus its result. Columbus went to his grave, convinced he had found a western route to Asia. In that sense, his 4 voyages were a complete failure. He never found the grand cities of the Great Khan or the spice markets of India. But in a way, no one could have possibly predicted. The discovery was a colossal, game-changing success for the Spanish crown. He hadn't found a new route. He'd stumbled upon 2 entire continents, a new world teeming with resources and people. Spain's focus was about to shift dramatically from the old world to the new. The news of Columbus's discovery spread like wildfire and immediately ignited a diplomatic crisis. Who did this new world belong to? Spain's biggest rival, Portugal, was furious. They had spent the better part of a century investing in their African route, and now Spain had just leapfrogged them with a single voyage. Tensions were so high that war seemed imminent. To settle the dispute, both Catholic nations turned to the highest authority they recognized, the Pope. Pope Alexander VI, who happened to be Spanish, issued a decree in 1493. It drew an imaginary line down the globe, from pole to pole, just west of the Cape Verde Islands. Everything to the west of that line, discovered or undiscovered, would belong to Spain. Everything to the east would belong to Portugal. Portugal, however, wasn't satisfied. They felt the Pope's line boxed them in too much, so they entered into direct negotiations with Spain. A year later, in 1494, they signed the Treaty of Tours. This treaty moved the demarcation line significantly further to the west. It might seem like a small change on a map, but this diplomatic shift had enormous consequences. It pushed the line far enough west that it cut across the eastern bulge of South America. This is the historical reason why Brazil became a Portuguese colony, while the rest of Central and South America fell under Spanish influence. With the legal and diplomatic claims secured, Spain wasted no time. The era of exploration quickly morphed into the era of conquest and colonization. Columbus himself led a second, much larger expedition in 1493. This was no small exploratory fleet. It was a full-blown colonizing force of 17 ships and over 1,200 men. They established the first permanent European settlement in the Americas on the island of Hispaniola, which is today shared by the Dominican Republic and Haiti. What were they looking for? The answer was simple and brutal: gold. The initial reports of natives wearing small gold ornaments fueled a relentless and rapacious quest for precious metals. Now, you must be wondering, what does this have to do with Xaymaca or Jamaica? The answer is simple: everything. Now let's shift our focus back to the Tainos. Imagine a life woven into the very fabric of nature. Let's recap a bit. Their days would be spent swaying gently in a hammock, what we now know as Xaymaca, lulled by the Caribbean breeze, the air thick with the aroma of slow-cooked meat on a barbacoa, what we now call barbecue, a tradition of community and shared meals. This was the rhythm of the Taino people, a civilization that thrived in places we now call Cuba, Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, and Jamaica, or as they knew it, Xaymaca. But a storm was gathering, a huracan. Unlike any they had ever known, this wasn't a tempest born of wind and water, but one of wood, steel, and ambition, sailing across the vast, unknown ocean from the east. Did you catch that? Hammock, barbecue, hurricane, Jamaica, even the name Taino itself. These are not just words, they are echoes of a lost world, linguistic artifacts gifted to us from the Arawakan language spoken by these very people. They are the ghosts of a culture we are about to rediscover. The Taino were a society of profound spiritual depth and intricate social structure. Their world was governed by caciques, or chiefs, and their connection to the divine was channeled through sacred objects, called Xaymas. They held the wisdom of generations, but we now wonder when they would inhale the smoke of sacred tobacco, cohoba, through a Y-shaped pipe, entering a trance to commune with the Xaymas. What did the spirits whisper as strange new stars, the sails of Columbus's ships, appeared on the horizon? Did they warn of the cataclysm to come? This is not just a story of dates and names, of 1492 and Christopher Columbus. Well, maybe they did. We know that Taino were expert farmers. That developed a sophisticated agricultural system called kanako, mounting soil into knee-high mounds. We also know they were skilled fishermen and navigators, using massive canoes carved from a single silk cotton tree, capable of holding dozens of people to trade and travel between islands. They were artists, poets, and storytellers. The aretos I mentioned were more than just dances. They were living histories, epic poems sung and acted out to preserve their traditions and mythologies. Their pottery was intricate, their stonework precise, and their understanding of the natural world was encyclopedic. They had names for every plant, every animal, every star in the sky. This was a world rich in culture, knowledge, and peace. When they say the first foreigners, though, they must have thought these were beings from another world. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey. If you found this story as moving and important as I do, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into the histories that have shaped our world. See you next time.